Alright guys, continuing on with the review for APUSH 2013-14. This one we're going to deal with Chapter 11 and Chapter 12, the Old West and Industrialization. So the first thing we're going to deal with expansion to the west is the Transcontinental Railroad, and you need to know that it's two different companies, Union Pacific and Central Pacific, working from the east and the west, trying to meet in the middle. And one of the big factors of this is who built it on both sides. On the eastern side of it, working west, you've got Irish immigrants who are working mainly on the railroad, and from the west, you've got Chinese immigrants known as coolies who are working through it. We've talked about in class previously about some of the difficulties these guys faced. The Irish, the main one was the threat from Native Americans, and the Chinese was just simply the geography of building through the Sierra Nevada mountains. As far as the consequences of this go, as this expansion occurs, you see the near extinction of the buffalo, and that really impacts the native peoples because that was their staple animal. That's what their life was predicated on. I think you heard my wife cough in the background on that, by the way. So as it becomes extinct, or as it becomes less and less, it severely impacts their lives, and also the westward migration of American settlers and all that comes with that. So once again, the transformation of the Plains Indians comes about mainly because of the near extermination of the buffalo. There's also a couple more factors that play into this. Number one is the disease that are introduced into the Native American population due to the expansion of American settlers, and also just the general change in the economy that happens as this railroad comes through. You begin to see the growth of towns, more and more people coming in, and the exploitation or the taking of natural resources from the west and things like that. Now, as this expansion happens, there's obviously going to be some critics of it. One of the main one was a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson, who wrote a book called *A Century of Dishonor*, in which she talked about how by going into these westward lands, by exploiting certain things and affecting Native American culture, we had in fact betrayed the natives as we expanded. And it's a very influential work, and you need to be able to know what it is and what the reason for it being written was. So another result that happens as this westward migration occurs is how are we going to deal with the interactions between natives and the settlers who go out there? And the first attempt by the government to do it is called the Dawes Act, and it had a couple of goals. Number one, it was an attempt to reform the government's Native American policy. In other words, to put in writing how we're going to deal with these things as they come about. The big go of it, tying into that, was assimilation, or how to bring natives into American culture, how to make them American, for lack of a better term. As far as the consequences of it go, I don't have it on this slide, but it is in the review book. As far as the consequences, um, it does when they do. They don't take into effect. They basically ignore Native American tradition, culture, and etc. In this and how it ties into the land that natives own that eventually these settlers are going to attempt to take. By 1900, I'm sorry, the Indians had lost 50% of the land that they had just several years before. Another effect, it remains the cornerstone of American Native policy for the next 50 years or so, and it also leads to the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which looks at the flaws in the Dawes Plan and kind of reverses, or partially reverses, um, the way in which they go about it. So be aware of the goals and consequences of this as we go. Next on our list, and we're kind of going into the conflicts between settlers or Americans as they move out west and Native Americans. One of these centers around the ghost dance. And the ghost dance was an attempt by Native Americans to basically get rid of the white presence in the western lands, to get rid of white civilization. And it was a ritual that talked about how the buffalo would come back. Remember, the buffalo had been basically exterminated at this point, about how it would come back and lead to white civilization vanishing. Well, the American government, our government, doesn't really go for this, so we go out and we try to basically squash this thing. And what it leads to is the Battle of Wounded Knee, in which 200 Indian men and women and children were killed, or I guess you could say massacred, at this battle. And it's another step in the diminishing or deterioration between relations between the natives and Americans. Next, we've got to talk about the fading frontier and something called the frontier or the Turner thesis. And basically, what happens in 1890, the census report comes out and says that for the first time in American history, we basically don't have a frontier anymore. So, in response to this, the significance of the frontier in American history is written, and what it says is that we've got to have somewhere to explore. Okay, the existence of cheap, unsettled land had played a role in American society. What it is. So he's tying this frontier spirit into what America has become. It had helped shape a distinctive American spirit of democracy and egalitarianism or equality. It acted as a safety valve, and other things like that that you can see in the book. It also helps with nationalism, is another thing I just noticed. And I apologize for looking at my book so much, but I'm trying to do this quick. Um, and basically, what it comes out and says is that we've got to have a frontier just to keep our society, to keep America advancing. So it was a very brief synopsis of the attempts to expand westward after the Civil War. Now we're going to move to Chapter 12 with Industrial America from 1865 to 1900. One of the main themes of this, I guess, of this chapter of industrialism is consolidation. And we're talking about big business. The fact that businesses become larger during this time period than they ever have in American history. And it's all because of this consolidation. And there's a couple of forms of it you need to be aware of. Number one is horizontal integration. And horizontal integration means and it's all about forming kind of monopolies, I guess you could call it. But horizontal means you consolidate horizontally across one level of the production cycle. So if we're talking about something like, I don't know, producing steel or something like that, you might own one component of that. You might own all the factories that produce steel across the entire business. Another one is vertical integration, and this is how Andrew Carnegie did it. Horizontal, the best example of that is John D. Rockefeller, by the way. But with vertical integration, Andrew Carnegie and the steel business, he owned every step along the way, from taking the raw materials to producing the finished product. So every step of the production process is owned by one person. Now that helps out in a couple of ways. It allows them to save money. They can do it more cheaply. They can also ensure the qualities of the materials that are used, and you really don't have to deal with any middlemen or anything like that. So you control every step of the process. Also, out of this, horizontal and vertical integration becomes trust, which is a collection of companies in one segment of the business industry, and monopolies, which means you control every part of that industry. Now, out of this consolidation comes several things as far as the consequences of it go. Number one is you see a lot of factories come up in America during this time period. And factories, you know, just basic, it's a place where a product is produced, all right? And it's mechanization plays into this as well. So you start to see a lot of mindless, basic jobs come about that begins to, I don't know, it allows craftsmen to kind of fade away. In other words, having a skill is not as important anymore as being able to run a machine. You also see scientific management come into play, and this is where they're trying to do things more efficiently. And scientific management was a theory from a guy, um, I can't remember, from Frederick Taylor, which studied how a factory worked and tried to get these things as efficient as possible. And then capital and railroads come out of it as well. And the fact that people are putting a lot of money, they're investing a lot of money in these factories, and railroads become very widespread during this time as a way to get raw materials to factories and finished goods to markets. Now, out of this factory system, out of this the industrialization becomes a response, and it comes in fact in the form of labor and labor unions. Now, the things that allow these unions to get going. Number one, you have an expanded workforce at this time. You've got a lot of immigrants, you've got a lot of women, you've got a lot of children working in these factories, and it's coming at the expense of basically white men, people who have traditionally worked in these jobs. And through this competition, factories are beginning to hire these immigrants, women, and children over men because they can pay them less salary. They can pay them less money to do the same job. So there's a threat to the traditional labor roles of men. Also, you see machines become very popular, which, like I said earlier, begins to replace kind of the craftsmanship of works, and it's a lot easier. So, because of that, you're able to hire less skilled people like immigrants, women, and children. Also, with the corporations, you have less people being in control of an industry, so it leads to a lowering of salaries and a worsening of working conditions. And also, international markets play a role in this as well. All right, so you need to be aware of a couple of these labor unions as they arise. And the first one is the Knights of Labor, which was founded by a man named Terence Powderly. Now, a lot of these, or all of these unions, are starting for or labor organizations, as you might see them called, are starting for the same reasons. They're starting because working conditions suck. They're not being paid a lot of money. It's dangerous. All these things are going into, workers wanting better conditions. The Knights of Labor was a combination of skilled and unskilled workers, and they're fighting for these things that I just talked about. Now, the downfall of the Knights of Labor is the Haymarket Square bombing, which actually wasn't done by members of the Knights of Labor, but it gets tied in them. They get looped into violence having to do with labor organizations, and it leads to them kind of going down. Next is the industrial workers of the world, or the IWW, also known as Wobblies. They're also a combination of skilled and unskilled workers. Now, these guys are a little bit different than the Knights of Labor because they did, in fact, endorse violence as a means to get to the end. In other words, they felt that any means necessary to get the better conditions that they were looking for their workers. Next is the American Federation of Labor, started by a man named Samuel Gompers. Now, they're a little bit different than the two that we previously discussed because they only accepted skilled workers into their organization. The AFL is still around today. They have combined during modern times with the CIO, which you see from this picture right here. But they are going for the same things: better working conditions, better pay. But they're only focusing on skilled workers. That is the main difference between them and the other. Now, out of these labor unions come a couple of strikes you need to be aware of. The first one is the Homestead strike, which is not on here, but it dealt with Carnegie Steel, and also the Pullman strike listed here, which dealt with conditions at the Pullman Palace Car Company. Around 12,000 workers go on strike after the Pullman Company decided to cut wages in what was known as a company town. Now, the way this worked back then is there would normally be, or there would in some cases, be a town that would develop around a factory, and a lot of the businesses in the town would be owned by the factory as well. So they're cutting wages while keeping prices the same because the company's trying to make more money. Well, in response to this, the workers are not able to get the value out of their money that they had before, so they go on strike and they begin to protest. Um, what the effects of it, what it does is it eventually ends a lot of railroad commerce because this company is producing a lot of the cars that are on rail lines during this time. It gets to the point where the president at the time, President Cleveland, in an effort to put this thing down and to end it, has to call in federal troops. And that's really the significance. It's the first time that federal troops are called in regards to ending a strike. All right, the last thing we're going to deal with in this is immigration for time purposes. You need to be able to differentiate between old and new immigration, and you'll have a chart based on that in class. But during the late 1880s, you see a new wave of immigration come in. It's different from the old one. Remember, old was German and Irish. This one is concentrated more on Southern and Eastern Europe, Italy, the Balkans, Greece, places like that. We're also dealing with a significant wave of Chinese immigration during this time period as well, particularly to work on railroads and to deal with the, I don't know, I guess you could call it the burgeoning economy in California. It gets to the point, and this ties into the nativist aspect of immigration that we talked about before, the fact that American people are scared about losing jobs, they're scared about the intermingling of cultures and intermingling of the races. So, in an effort to get rid of Chinese immigration, to get rid of this quote unquote threat, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 is passed, which is the first law to exclude an ethnic group from coming to America. So it prohibited Chinese immigration. Now, as I spoke about earlier, there's an extreme rise in nativism during this time as well, not only to the Chinese immigrants in California and the West Coast, but also to these new immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the opposition is because of, and it's what it always boils down to, the difference in religion between Protestantism and Catholicism, and a lot of these new immigrants coming in are Catholic. Also, as opposed to people coming in from Ireland previously, a lot of these new immigrants coming in do not speak English when they hit the shore. So the different languages, the different cultures, the different religion, and all that plays in from a social and cultural aspect. Also, there's an economic aspect to it as well. That is the loss of jobs that are being taken by these immigrants coming in. Remember, due to the factory system and this industrialization, a lot of the jobs are unskilled at this time. So you don't necessarily have to have any skills to be able to do it. And these immigrants fit into this profile of the workers that these factories want perfectly. They don't have a lot of skills. They don't have to pay them a lot, and they certainly can pay them less than Americans that are already here. And it's partly because the immigrants are just looking for a job, period, to get some kind of money to be able to improve their lives. All right, you also see a new industrial order come about during this time. Supporters of this industrialization and the treatment of workers and whatever it is, and also the consolidation of businesses, use social Darwinism to justify these actions. And social Darwinism is basically survival of the fittest. All right, the strong at the top, and they use this to advocate, monopolies and things like that. On the other side, you have reformers who kind of want to level this out a little bit, and Carnegie is one of them with his gospel of wealth and also the social gospel, which ties in the Christian spirit into helping out immigrants and things like that. And also, there's a couple of literary and artistic movements during this time that I don't have time to go into in depth in. Realism plays into literature, and the Ashcan School into art. So that wraps up chapters 11 and 12. That should get you through the weekend, and we will roll on to chapter 13 in the next one.